Okay, so I'm going to try to get through the prologue and then the part 1, which is chapters 1 and 2. If we don't get to chapter 2, then somebody can do it next week. But chapter 2 is kind of weird anyway, so I'm just going to whip through it. He's talking about sources and stuff. So, Andrew Bolton, I didn't even look up who knows his history?
He's an Englishman.
He's an Englishman.
April and Ryan know their
He was
son.
an apostle.
I'm sorry I didn't look that up. That's what Paul would have done, and I didn't do it.
He
So,
came to the United States to be the peace and justice
Yeah.
coordinator.
oh, that's right, yeah.
He has
And
two
later
sons.
Became an apostle.
One's also an author who wrote about Charles Neff.
2 sons, one's a doctor. Okay,
One wrote the books on Charles Neff, Matthew.
Matthew Bolton. Okay.
And David Bolton played at our wedding,
Played what? Played what?
piano.
Piano. Okay.
And the organ, didn't he?
Well, he's your age then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Ryan's age.
I think there was a bio on him somewhere.
Is there a bio on the back?
It's very small.
It was a very small bio.
He was a school teacher of ethic and world religions. We don't have that. And in
Did you keep up with
super diverse,
I didn't.
I don't know how to pronounce it. Something England. Leicester. Then a lecturer in education at Westminster, Oxford. He later continued peace and justice ministries for his church, which is ours, and subsequently led pastoral care and peace and justice missions with 220 congregations to, I wish I could read, 10 countries in Asia.
Yeah, I was going to say he was with Apostle Sakini.
So don't ask me. I mean, I do not know my history of apostles like I should. Well, we need.
Science guy too. He
Yeah.
got his PhD in there.
Horticulture.
It's horticulture is with genetics
Okay.
Scientific.
and plants.
Okay, we got enough.
So he does-
That gives us a little feel for
He's a
who.
smart dude.
He is.
Okay.
Him and his wife are involved in L'Arche a lot.
And what?
L'Arche, the community with for people with disabilities. They're the ones that turned me on to it.
Okay.
What's it called? L'Arche.
L.
L-A.
B-A-R-C-H-E.
Isn't
He a rather black writer.
I know that he's written quite a few books. I mean, do we know how many? Did it say?
There's communities all over the world.
All right. The part that he told us about in his life that really made a profound effect on him was that his father was in World War II. And so there were times then when he was a young man, when Andrew was young, that I don't know why it was Tuesdays and Fridays, but Tuesdays and Fridays, Dad would come home drunk, and so Mom had to kind of take care of the family for years, and then it wasn't until his father said that there was a moment in his life when he finally got some peace. And part of that moment was because he went back and read the Bible. And so the Sermon on the Mount is very, very personal to Andrew Bolton. And I think that's why he wrote it for us, because he wants us, I like this word, he says it gets under your skin. And he and his wife then took a trip to I guess Israel, and I don't know exactly where Lake Galilee is. It's where supposedly the Sermon on the Mount was. That's what people predict. They speculate. But he said it was a very profound experience for them. And then I didn't know. I did look this up. Gandhi, the Indian. He's a Hindu, the Indian Hindu man, said that when he went to England to study, a very good friend of him, good Christian man, handed him the Bible. And he's like, well, I really liked how he said, I read it I read the Old Testament before my friend. He was bored, starting with Genesis. It's like it really, it kind of defeats the purpose for reading the Bible sometimes, because it's like who's begatting who and all that. But he said that Gandhi said when he got to the New Testament, and especially the Sermon on the Mount, this is when he said the New Testament produced a different impression, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which went straight to my heart. I really liked that quote from Gandhi. So the question on this little screen for us is, there's several questions. You can answer anything you want. What parts of it, of the Sermon on the Mount, just, from your own background, stand out to you? Does it get under your skin? And if so, how? So think about that for a minute in terms of your own experience with the Sermon on the Mount, whether it's recently or as, your childhood growing up.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Blessed are the peacemakers. That's the one that stands out to you.
Mhm.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
I think what stands out to me a little bit is not necessarily any particular passage, but the extremes are easy. What you should not do to your neighbor, whatever, or who should not be treated how. But it's the subtleties of our judgmental natures
Mhm.
that it's like, when you read it,
Yeah.
like, oh,
Yeah.
that kind of takes away the obviousness of what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. I like that. In a more positive way, it's saying this is kind of this is an ideal for you to strive for.
This may be overly simplistic, but it's always struck me as a prescription for living. If you follow this,
Yeah.
you will likely lead a very happy life.
Yes.
Somewhere along the line, I'll just leave it at that.
Yes. I do have to say that, not to get political or anything, but it is interesting to me that a lot of Christians want the 10 Commandments in the schools. And honestly, I think we should have, if we're going to have religion in schools, which of course I disagree with, then it needs to be the Sermon on the Mount, because to me that's kind of the opposite in terms of how you're looking at the scriptures. You have the don'ts in the 10 Commandments, and you have the do's in the Sermon on the Mount. So I just have always been curious why it has to be the 10 Commandments. It is historical, obviously, but.
Well, Jane, I think the Sermon on the Mount is such a contrast with the culture of the time. The Roman
Say
Empire,
that again, Sharon, I'm sorry.
the Roman Empire was brutal
Yes.
wherever they were,
Yes.
not just in Galilee,
Mhm.
wherever they were.
Pax Romana. Mhm.
And Sermon on the Mount is the total opposite.
It is.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Yeah.
Blessed are the meek. It just
Yeah.
turns everything on its head.
It was really literally his protest against that kind of rule, because we'll see a little bit later that Mr. Bolton uses the word Pax Romana quite a bit, and I looked it up because I knew what generally it meant, but it literally means Roman peace. Peace. But what it's known for is in order to get that peace, they were very violent to people and they were very oppressive. And so Roman peace is kind of an oxymoron, So,
Well, it's supposed to be absence of conflict.
right,
That kind of peace, not true peace.
Right.
Not shalom.
right. Yeah, good point. Good point. Not shalom.
I said to Joyce when I was reading the beginning of the book, I said, I disagree. He was talking about the counter-terrorists and to counter the terrorism of the Romans. But the reality is the Romans were the government, and the people who were doing the acts that they were doing they were the terrorists.
They were. In the sense that we all know the word now. You don't call a government terrorists, but it was. I mean, they were. If you want to look at, what were they doing? They were terrorizing their communities, So, yeah, okay. So here's another question slide for you. There's going to be more questions than these are very short chapters, so I like asking questions. So Andrew Bolton talks about the process of studying the history, especially the history of the Bible. And he likes to read history through the eyes of the victims, not the conquerors, which I thought was interesting. Every history class I've ever taken has been from the perspective of this is what Napoleon did, this is what this, as you go through society, you read it through the conqueror's viewpoint. So he says he likes reading it through the victims because it's like seeing history through the cross, through Jesus's experience, which I really liked. So his one of his phrases is, his hope is that no child should go to bed hungry, be terrorized by war or violence, or have to face massive climate change. So every part of his experience in life is about, kind of speaking out for those victims and seeing the world through the victim's eyes. So I really liked that. So anybody, history buff, several of us are, I believe. So what is it that how do you like to read history? And, what do you think of this concept of reading history through the eyes of the victims?
It makes it more real. when you're reading it from the attacker's point of view, it seems like it's more up here and the people are just collateral damage.
Yeah.
But when you're reading it from the victim's point of view, you're connecting with the ones that suffer from what's going on.
Well, for the victims to be able to write history, they have to have an advocate like Andrew Bolton.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as you pointed out, history is written by the winners, and those are also the side that usually have the most literacy. We're looking at history of people who were illiterate largely,
Right.
and we don't have any firsthand eyewitness accounts of most of the things that, looking at history sitting across, so we have to imagine.
Not enough chairs.
We've got
Chairs up there, no?
Yeah, look right there. Oh, right here. Right there. And move it around.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
I'm just, the poor and the downtrodden don't usually get.
They don't have a voice. Yeah, that's very true.
It's
true.
very hard to read. It's very hard to read the history through the losers or the oppressed because of that.
Yeah.
Because it's written by the winners. And
that's why the stories. I mean, I think of the Holocaust in particular. The stories of the people who were either really trying to sneak the Jews out, or or hiding, and when you read something about from that perspective of the victims, it's more profound to me. It's like, oh, that was not just a war for the whole world. That was a war because somebody. I hope. I mean, it's interesting that Americans didn't really know the full horror until they came upon the camps. But it just really always strikes me when I read books about the Holocaust from the victim's standpoint that it's just so much more real. And
It takes a 2D picture that is portrayed by the victors, and then it gives it a 3D feel. But it's also something that probably hasn't been readily available until at best the late 18th century, because there was no way to document.
Yeah.
There weren't people who were chronicling for the victim.
Yeah, the Roman Church certainly wasn't.
I always said that. Well, it just wasn't that much.
Well,
Wait, Sharon first, please.
And to bring it into our time,
Mm-hmm.
we're having a real debate in the United States right now
Mm-hmm.
about what history is.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be a group that only wants to remember the very best parts.
Yeah.
When we were
their definition.
when we were noble and
Mm-hmm.
accomplishing good things.
Mm-hmm.
But the bad stuff is part of history too. And I want to know it all.
Mhm.
And where I grew up, I have a appreciation of what happened to Native Americans. They all ended up in Oklahoma. Well, not all, but a whole lot of tribes did. And that's not where they originated. That's not where they wanted.
Yeah. It took a long time for Americans to really come to grips with that history,
Knowledge that it
to acknowledge it. Yes.
you know.
Yes.
Just,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, April or Arlene.
I'm just gonna say that a lot of times the oral histories of the victims was so suppressed that they weren't even allowed to talk about their experience.
Yeah.
So it didn't get passed on very well, other than secretly in the houses.
Whispers.
And now that, as history goes and people are more welcome or more able to talk, it's still taboo for that society to really talk. So it makes it hard for them to share their experience.
It's really hard to look at the negative sides of even ourselves. People don't like to look in the mirror and see negative. Go ahead, Arlene. And
I was just going to say, think about the impact that the Diary of Anne Frank had on most of us when we were in school. It was a book that I read when I was in middle school, probably, and it touched so much and so many people. To see somebody that had to hide. Our country, who's never gone through being afraid of a bomb falling, don't feel what it feels like to have that terror every day.
But people are being hidden now.
Right. Exactly.
We have to be aware that there are things like that happening in our country right now. Karen?
Well, I'm thinking, to piggyback on what David said, as history now, we have things like the Holocaust Museum. We have things like World War I Museum in New Orleans, where you are put in the persona of the victim.
Yeah. Has anybody been to the Holocaust Museum?
Traveling through the museum.
Yeah, but not for a long time.
And so the focus on the victim, and then, like Arlene said, Uncle Tom's Cabin, for me,
Oh, yeah.
was a radical
It was.
new
That's an
look
awesome
at
book.
life on a plantation.
Yeah. With the good guys, with the good slave owners. That's how she was so controversial, is that she everybody hated the slave owner that was brutal to his slaves, but nobody really thought about what about the slave owner who's really nice to his slaves. He's still a slave owner. That was the controversy she threw out into the world, to I think help slavery end. Go ahead, Jonathan.
We also have to be aware that even today, some of the exhibits in the Smithsonian Institute have been taken down
Mhm.
because they contradicted what the current administration wants history to look like.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to make it political. I'm just simply saying we need to be aware that even museums and such
Mhm.
are influenced by people in power at the
Mhm.
time. They say history is written by the victors,
Mhm.
and the current victors
The
want
The
to rewrite
powerful.
them.
Yeah. History is written by the powerful, not the
Yeah.
powerless.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so Sharon alluded to this. Jesus lived in difficult times. So the Jewish temple was still the center of the Jewish people's life at the time, and so we've talked about that in some other classes. Where temple living and temple rites were very different after the temple was destroyed. It became the Jewish faith that we all are more aware of, with the rabbis and the synagogues and what I personally love, the debate among all of the Jewish people. I love that. I think the debate was probably there all along. Am I right? But what Andrew Bolton talks about is that it was the high priests and the ruling Herodian families that profited from the alliance with the Romans. So, everybody hates the tax collector in the Bible, but Andrew points to there were actually three taxes on these peasants. There was the temple tithes, the taxes to support Herod, and then a tax tribute to Rome. Could you imagine? I mean, we have a lot of taxes, but they were getting crushed by these taxes. And there was profit in the temples. That's why Jesus came in and smote the money changers, as I like to say. Go ahead, David.
So as I recall, in the book, you talked about how the temple was a geopolitical center as well, which speaks to the collection of taxes,
Yes.
the enrichment of the clergy, for lack of a better term. And then I'm going to share a small quip from being Jewish. If you put three Jews in a room, the only thing that you can get them to agree on is how much the other one should pay for dues.
Okay. That's just Jewish humor.
I said it was a quip.
I know. Okay. So I didn't realize this, that, around the time Jesus was born, because of course, everybody kind of just guesses when Jesus was born. They think he was around 4 BC, which is funny because that's 4 years before he was supposedly born. But around that time, there was a huge revolt in Nazareth, and the Romans crucified 2,000 men. And this is the society that Jesus is born into. And remember, when Herod heard the news, this is in our Bible, when Herod heard the news of Jesus' birth from the Magi, I think didn't he tell the Magi that they're supposed to come and tell him so he would be ready for it?
One of the stories, yes. Yeah. One of the gospels.
Yeah, and then the Magi decided not to tell him,
They returned to their own country another way.
Exactly.
They were told in
So
a
he
dream.
went into a rage and he slaughtered all the baby boys younger than 2. And so this is who Jesus was. He was a refugee into Egypt when he was born. So this is that victim personality that Jesus actually had, and I don't think he acted like a victim, but I think it's fair to say that his people were victimized from the day of his birth, and so he grew up in how to handle that Roman culture that he was born into.
And they used their holidays and their remembrance days to remind their people every year
That's right.
of
That's
what
right.
they went through.
That's right. I mean, Passover. That's what it's all about. Yeah, exactly. And I like how Andrew Bolton talks about that trauma, especially his. You think of a boy whose father fought in World War II, and any person who fights in any war is going to
World
come
War
back.
II or World War II?
It's going to come back traumatized. And so that then traumatizes the family in ways that we're not even aware of, and then that traumatizes the next generation. The trauma goes on and on, in my opinion, until somebody recognizes it and tries to talk it through and try to move their own experience into like this awareness that we're talking about. I think it's dangerous to ignore the past. I think it's important to remember the past. I lived in Germany for a year, and my German friends told me that, we don't forget the Holocaust. I mean, they really do study it and make sure from the German perspective, we're not doing this again. That was 84. I don't know if they're still saying that, but
Yeah. I was going to say, I was there last year and they talk about, I mean, they do that and they look at how quick it can happen. And
Yes.
You think you're ignoring something
Yes.
and then it happens and you don't even, that's
Yes.
the thing they're very aware of.
Yes.
And our guides and people, they grew up in that area. And when you talk about not being afraid, I'm sorry, I grew up with the bomb under my desk in school. We didn't have tornado, we had bombed it. And we
Bomb
talked about,
threats, yeah.
I came from
That's
Joplin
clever.
and I'm driving in this beautiful day yesterday and coming through thinking how hard it is to think about. I mean, we are this close to having something in the middle of the Midwest. And how do we know we don't? And I don't want to live that way, but at the same time, you have to be aware, and it is the trauma, it's that thought process that we're all living all the time.
Yeah.
And I remember going, one of the wars, whatever one you went to, Paul. Recent, when you went again, I know, the most recent, and I was sitting by my young son, who we celebrate when he came out, and saying goodnight to him and thinking and crying for the mothers across the country and world who are doing this. I want my son to grow up. I want my daughter to grow, and anyway, that trauma it's never going to go away in the life we live right now. We all have some sort of trauma.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about that, looking at it, and
Absolutely.
anyway.
Yeah, Lee's
And
dad,
Nadine's sister, just so you know.
Yes. She knows Paul.
I'm just wandering off the street. I did. But actually, no, I didn't wander because I was on her bumper, so she couldn't even see my headlights.
Sisters, yeah.
Lee's dad was in the war, and I guess he woke up a lot of times with horrible nightmares, dealing with, what he remembered, but he wouldn't talk about it.
They call that silent generation,
Mhm.
which is too bad because it might have helped them and their offspring
Right.
if they had talked about it. I will never forget. I just forgot his name.
Way back in the files, and you got it out.
He was in my home, so I'm picturing it. Cliff Gaston was in the Battle of the Bulge. And I had read all these stories about the Battle of the Bulge, and it never really came to life until he told us that he was sitting in a tree. And anybody who knows about the Battle of the Bulge knows that the trees got hit a lot.
Yeah.
And
He was the lookout.
he was looking.
Actually, he was a forward artillery spotter. He was behind enemy lines when a lot of that
Yeah.
happened.
I know. It's like, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. So even you get that soldier's perspective, Battle of the Bulge is a really important part of the World War II history. But we met a guy that lived it, Go ahead.
Okay, back when they used to have the single dances at the hotels, they don't do that anymore. But I met a veteran of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
He told me that he was 18 years old in 1944. He was in the Battle of the Bulge.
He was.
And he was telling me about it.
Yeah, it makes it different now than when you think of the battle now, that history. It becomes more alive for us because we know the people. So that's.
Well, it makes me think about when Jonathan spoke about adopting a grade. That really hit me.
That was Brian. Brian did.
Brian.
Yeah, Brian did that country that goes and adopts an American grave. That was an awesome story.
Yeah.
And that they're
Yeah.
generational and that there's a massive wait list.
Yeah,
That's
pretty cool.
the cool thing about that.
A lot of towns have done that because they
They
were their heroes.
they fought in
rescued them.
their countries. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a great uncle who never spoke when he came back from World War II, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
Point of interest, if you're interested in learning more about the Battle of the Bulge,
No, never.
the historian Heather Cox Richardson has been doing a multi-part telling of what happened during the Battle of the Bulge.
I think
And
we're getting
it's
better.
online.
We're getting better at telling those stories from all different perspectives now. I think that's what makes us remember. It's always good to remember.
I was going to say also, this is kind of a little bit different topic, but when Andrew Bolton talks about being a kid and playing war with his brothers, which everyone did, cowboys and Indians,
Yep.
army soldiers, his dad was living the trauma, which the boys didn't know.
No.
So he was drinking and then really affecting the family, and the boys had no clue what was, what his dad's trauma, that he was even experiencing trauma. As a kid, you're just living with what you got.
But then when he learned of why his dad was that way, he looked differently at those games.
Right.
It changed him too.
Yeah.
So I thought that was, Okay, so learning the context of ministry. I kind of like this topic because it's the context of Jesus's ministry. And then Andrew Bolton's also asking us to remember the context of our own ministry, which I think is important. So he goes on and on about, you have to kind of look at the whole story of Matthew and, who was Matthew and who was he speaking to. And then I just threw it in there because it's kind of odd. There was a pattern. Some people like to see the patterns in scriptures and everything else. There's a pattern of threes, and I'm not sure if that was done deliberately or if we as researchers were all like, oh, hey, there's a pattern when.
Threes are very important. And I, as a writer, threes, if you look at it, beginning, middle, and end, if you look at 3 fairy tales, 3 this, 3 that,
Yeah.
threes have from way back when they have a meaning, from fairy tales to mythology and all that. They are part of something.
I never understood why.
When I saw that, I thought, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it is.
Till landscaping. You can never do 3.
Decorating.
2s or 4s,
Yeah.
decorating. You gotta do 3s.
Yeah, Robin taught me that.
But it's
3 rings.
3 rings
Token.
Yep.
to rule, 1 ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them.
Oh, boy.
I mean, you go back.
I had to spit that out. The elves have 3 rings. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so 3 is a big number. I like how Andrew was talking about, remember the Romans did not accept Christianity for the first 300 years. And so they were living in that persecution. And what was different for them is that they didn't revolt. They actually clung. He's talking about how they kind of clung to the Sermon on the Mount stories to get themselves through it, And so I thought, well, it would, like we were saying earlier, it would really be good from our Christian perspective that we tell our friends and family and people who aren't Christian the Beatitudes, because that is the heart of Christianity for me, at least. And so I wanted to put this one last question in there because I actually he didn't say it. Andrew Bolton didn't say it, but we've kind of been skirting around it a bit. I've been listening to a lot of Catholic priests. We have this big war right now between the Pope and Trump. And what, the Pope is being criticized for being anti-war, but what one of the cardinals was saying in an interview was, Jesus was political. He wasn't partisan, but he was political. And I thought, oh, that's a very different way to look at it. So you hear a lot of Christians, that say, I mean, you know me, I love the Constitution and I love the separation of church and state.
What?
But it doesn't mean that we as church members, we as ministers shouldn't be political. We should be fighting for peace. I mean, look at our enduring principle. There's a lot of subtle political comments in there, and we've gotten criticism over that from over the years. But it's the choice that our church made, and then we have to decide as individual ministers what our not our partisan, what our political viewpoint is going to be of the world. So I thought that was really interesting to hear it from what Andrew Bolton is saying. Yes, go ahead.
Everything we do is political.
Yeah.
The speed limit we drive, the taxes that we just all pay, everything we do. As a teacher, people would say we don't have to know. My job was dependent upon a school board, upon a state board. Every decision that we live is political. And I mean, how our money is, our money management and all that kind of stuff that we've got. But I think to not be aware and aware, it's like it's partisan, it's a whole side.
Yeah.
And the whole thing we look at with our enduring principles and what we do, but we cannot bury our heads in the sand. We've got to be aware of it, and we got to go with what our direction is. And where we feel led with, and that's where the political, the enduring principles, that's what I started to say. But yeah, when people say, oh, I'm not political, I'm sorry, you cannot live, and I don't care where we live in the world. Everything is decided by boundaries that we have, the borders that we have, everything is political.
Yeah.
So.
Go ahead, David.
So this is what we were taught in religious school.
Okay.
As young Jews. That when they talked about the the Christians didn't join the revolution. The Jews were being persecuted. The Christians, not so much. They separated themselves from the Jews to protect themselves from the persecution. All of a sudden, the first day of the week, rather than being Monday, became Sunday. They distinguished themselves from the people who were being persecuted. Now, was that political? I don't know. Was it partisan? I don't know. But that's part of how the division between, because for the first X number of years, Christendom was a subset of Judaism, the distinction being Jesus was the Messiah. But within a certain period of time, probably that 300 years, all of a sudden it's separate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were taught, and of course that's a very self-serving point of view, because I mean, let's face it, Jews have been victims forever. Still are, right?
Chosen people, all that. Yeah, we got it. We got it.
At any rate, but that's, but I thought it was interesting because his comment that they did not join the revolution.
Yeah, you have a different perspective.
Well, it just underlined, because who knows when you're taught as a kid in Springfield, Missouri, whether it's right, real, or indifferent.
Okay.
But it only underlined.
Our churches look at our sanctuary. Our churches were built underneath the ships. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong.
You're right.
And that was that was what they were doing, is that they were hiding. I mean, if they would come out, then they would be persecuted. So I think they did withdraw more. So I think that's a fair criticism of what Andrew said,
Well, not a criticism. He just underlines it. He points to that whole notion.
Yeah. We did have our share of martyrs, though, David.
Yes.
Not as many. Not as many. Yes.
We were victims too. Everybody's like, we're competing about who's the
Who was victimized the most?
Once the Roman Empire got cranked up, crucifixion, there's no question that it shifted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting
they were equal
perspective.
opportunity persecutors.
Yeah. So then Andrew Bolton talks about the structure of the book, the whole book of Matthew, who Matthew might be. He might have been the apostle. He also might have been a Jewish Christian who was familiar with the rabbinic methods and possibly trilingual. And he was Jewish, but he was speaking to both the Jews and the Gentiles, which I think was important. And the Sermon on the Mount has 5 blocks of teaching. I'm sure we're going to get into the details of that, but it was like the Torah. And then for Bible scholars, it's also from Q. Remember, Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke were kind of a derivative from Mark, but also from this source. Well, actually means source in German. So Q is the source that nobody knows exactly where it is, But that's where some of those similarities in the synoptic gospels all come from. And so, there's the triads again. I really kind of latched onto that for some reason. Who was the audience? So when we're looking at the book of Matthew, we're looking at, there were many times he was speaking to his inner circle, to his committed disciples. He was usually chastising them. And then there was this outer crowd. He would talk to the crowd, Sermon on the Mount. And everybody knows that there are 2 stories of the bread, the loaves and the fishes, And so he was speaking to the outer crowd, the seekers, and then it switched to all nations. And then when Paul was writing, he was even when Matthew was writing, that's those new Christians, that were just coming from those first 100 years. And then I like how he said, and then there's us. We're the audience that I'm not sure Matthew predicted, but it has been, every Christian who sits in a Sunday school class is trying to figure out what the Bible means to us. That's what we do, And I personally like to look at what it meant to them first. We've been kind of learning that perspective in this class before I can figure out what it means to me. So then who was Antioch? That was the third largest city of the Roman Empire. And it was filled with that hatred and that ethnic antagonisms that we've been talking about. And that's where, Mr. Bolton talks about the Pax Romana. It's Roman peace, like the absence of war, I think is how Coral said it. But it's not peace. It's not shalom. It's just the absence of violence.
Usually assured deterrence.
Yeah. It's like, I'm going to stay quiet, I mean,
Peace enforced by violence, that doesn't even make sense.
it doesn't. It means
But that's what they did.
it's really silence is what it is, and then the rulers get to be at peace and the peasants and everybody else gets to live in fear, I like how Mr. Bolton talks about Matthew's gospel has a practical compassion for the most miserable. Somebody look up Matthew 25. It's just the 2 verses. It's the one we know really well, but I wanted somebody to actually read it for me.
Got it.
And as you're looking that up, the final, we're again just kind of looking at the setting where Matthew is. The Sermon on the Mount helped shape an alternative Christian identity and communal life that was an effective resistance to the violence, exploitation, poverty, and corruption of the Roman Empire. So that comes back to him talking about how those early Christians really clung to the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount to kind of give themselves hope, as they hid or as they, were trying to make sure that they could fit in. Anybody got it? Okay, go ahead, David.
For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.
And then he didn't go on, but the scripture goes on.
Then the righteous.
When did I do that, Lord?
Then the righteous answered him, Lord, when did you see hunger and feed? Dyslexia. When did the righteous? Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? I mean, it goes on.
Go ahead. What was his answer? We all know it, but it's fun to read it
again. When did you see a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did you see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me.
There you go. Isn't that the mantra of the Christian faith now? I mean, that's what Andrew Bolton thinks of when he thinks of Matthew, and then we're going to be going then into I think I just got through. Oh gosh. I didn't quite get everybody talking as long as I was hoping, but I did. I'm gonna read a couple of the prayer thoughts he had. He had some really interesting questions and prayer thoughts at the end of each chapter. So let me just read that since we have a little time here for you. I kind of like him ending in a prayer each time. So here's his prayer thought after chapter 1. Thank you, God, that in Jesus you entered fully and vulnerably into our hurting, traumatized world. Help us remember those that suffer violence today and be part of their relief and advocacy. We pray for conversion of our own hearts and also of those in power. Amen. So here is his prayer thought after chapter 2. God of then, God of now, God of Matthew, and God of us, guide us by your Holy Spirit as we use our minds fully to understand Jesus and congregational life for early Christians in difficult times. Amen. I like that. Our worship today is going to be talking about communal living. And I thought I put it in one of these. There's this book, the Sermon on the Mount is for individuals, but it's also, there it is. The story is personal, but it is also for living in fellowship and community. I loved those words that Andrew Bolton used. Because that, to me, that's what Mission Road is. You know, if we can't figure out as a group to live in community and fellowship the way Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, then what are we doing? You know, if we are modeling in our congregation what we hope to model in the other places that we go. And I do think I like the idea of using these concepts from the Sermon on the Mount to push us forward in our own personal religious life and in our community life. So that's the challenge. And I'm done. Anybody else have a challenge or a comment that they're just wanting to say?
Well, the golden rule is kind of based on the Sermon on the Mount, or vice versa. I don't know which one, but you know, it's principles that if you live by them,
do unto others.
It's very helpful to everybody.
And the golden rule is in many religions. It's a common thread in many religions, which I find hopeful. You know.
Well, and Jesus' ministry was always, in my opinion, reaching out to people in the margins that were totally ignored in the oppressive culture in which they live. You know, Jesus said that his message is for everyone.
Yeah.
And that included people on the margins.
Yeah. Well, it's like we were talking about earlier. It's giving the people in the margins voice, you know, and I think that we need to learn that lesson now. You know, we need to figure out who we think are oppressed, you know, in our own lives and what we see and what we hear, and then, you know, what is our response, you know?
You know, I meant to go back and see when this book was written, and I didn't.
Oh.
But it,
2025, I think.
Yeah.
It's 2025? Okay.
Yeah.
No wonder it's so relevant.
I was going to say they were advertising it at the last conference, which is when I ordered it.
2025, copyright 2025, so.
I think, didn't he write a previous book on Sermon on the Mount?
He did.
And then he
It was like
rewrote it.
reunion material.
Okay,
Like 25 years ago.
yeah,
Oh.
and he
Hey, this is rewritten.
Quite a
he
while.
updated.
Okay, all right. So who's teaching next week? All right, Dennis is teaching. Shall we just go with, we're ready for part 2.
We'll probably do chapters 3 and 4.
3 and 4, okay.
Is there anyone here? I'm going to hand out questions you can think about for next week
Okay.
that come from chapters 3 and 4. At the end of each chapter, they have some questions.
Ooh.
If you don't have the book, I'm going to give you questions that you can think about for the week.
All right.
I
I like getting homework.